Either God is real and he lets this happen. And if he does, doesn't that make him kind of a horrible jerk? Or God's not real?
There's evil stuff that goes on. And how can a good God let that happen? It's a messy answer.
It's not that I don't believe there's a God. I just don't like him.
Everybody stops at that one thought, though. You can't stop at that one thought.
What do you mean?
Got to keep going on that thought.
I love it.
In
I
fact-
want to live there.
No, you would complain.
The Bible was written by humans, so they concocted this God, and you're using the fiction that they concocted to prove that there's a God that they invented. In this episode, we're answering 3 of the biggest questions atheists are asking about God. Questions like, how God can allow evil in this world, how can we trust the Bible is real, and why God would condemn people to hell. To answer these questions, we interviewed theology professor John Wilkinson. For the last 20 years, John has worked here at LCBC as a pastor. He's even written a book that offers answers on the toughest questions about God. John, welcome to the Live Change podcast.
How you doing?
I'm so excited. I've been wanting to have you on the podcast for a long time. And especially, I decided to save a really easy topic like answering questions from atheists and skeptics. So we had you on the podcast for this episode.
Nice.
But I hand chose you for this one because I think that you probably more than anyone else I know have conversations with people where you're not afraid of a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Not everything has to be a debate or hostile, but they can be genuinely conversations where you're seeking to learn and listen as much as you are help.
Yeah, I like to find out what's making people tick. A lot of people see it as like, okay, here's a battle. Let's get ready. Yeah, and it's more like, no, I want to hear more about what you're thinking.
And what I love about that is these kind of conversations, I feel so ill-equipped, John, to be honest. I don't like getting ready for a battle, so I don't join.
Yeah.
So it's like, I
But
don't
you
want
of
to
anyone is probably the most equipped. All you got to do is ask questions. Honestly, I think people get it all out of order. They think like, oh, I got to have all the right things to say. No, you don't. You just say, so what makes you think that? Oh, it's interesting.
So you're
Tell
saying
me more about that. Yeah.
So it's not about having the right answers. It's about having the right questions.
Listening is the new speaking. Yeah. Like, honestly, no one listens anymore. And so when you authentically listen, then people go like, wow, I'll even say more. And what's fascinating is when people listen to other people, since no one's used to speaking, the stuff they have up here is no good. So then they say it, and then the person listening and just ask questions. And I've been 5 minutes into a conversation and the person's like, well, I don't really think that. Well, no, this sounds stupid. No, wait, let me just change that. And it's like they deconstruct their own points of view.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I think there has to be a respect there. Would you say there's a respect when you're having a conversation with a person?
Well, there's an interest. Yeah. Like, what do you think? And like, what makes you tick?
The kind of person, so like just so if I'm talking to other people about a subject matter, what really diffuses the conversation or makes me not want to have the conversation at all is if I feel like they're trying to trap me. Mm-hmm. And I think...
Yeah, my kids do that. You know, so like, I'll just be like, so why do you feel... Dad, stop using your Socratic stuff on me. And I'm like, I'm not. I really want to know because like halfway through it all falls apart. So it's like, no, I really want to know what's making you tick in this.
And I think that's why we want to go in as a conversation, not trying to entrap people. And if you hear commentaries about this and you go to YouTube, it's all debates. It's all about one trying to entrap the other, and I gotcha.
It's so much more interesting when you listen because then you can learn something. So if you only talk, you never learn. You're only regurgitating what's already up here. But if you see each encounter as like, I'm going to steal something, you know, like I might learn something new. And so you just keep drawing out like a sponge. That's what I like to do. I like to do that more than anything else.
Fantastic. And being a young adult pastor at LCBC, you've had, and also you've been in academia for a long time. So tell us first, where did you study?
Sounds so like ivory tower. I've been in academia. I don't even know if I can wear this, you know, like hoodie.
Shouldn't you have
I should like a tassel.
One of those sport coats
like
with
those
like
robes,
the patches on the elbows.
Phylacteries. Excuse me. I'm an academic.
So you okay, so you did some schooling. Okay, so tell me about your schooling.
So Penn State, we are.
Penn State,
Thank you.
There you go.
So Penn State was great because I learned everything that I should learn. I double majored in religious studies and philosophy. And so in that setting, I learned how the Bible's not true, Jesus never existed, you know, like all this stuff. So that was super helpful. Went on and got a master's and then a doctorate in theology and was able to see the other side of the page and say like, oh, So some of the things they said were true, but they didn't give the full story. And so I have great conversations with people who, they'll be like, "Oh, you wouldn't understand. You never studied this stuff." I'm like, "No, I actually have. Like, I know about biblical criticism. I know about like what the philosophy, like about postmodernism, feminism, metamodernism, Wicca, stuff like that. It's a lot of fun."
Wow. So
Yeah.
the first thing, so
Mhm.
right out of the gate, you can see that your approach to even learning was not to shut out the
Oh,
the voices.
no. My first approach to this whole thing was to like debunk everyone. Like I am going to completely destroy everybody, be the savior of theology and philosophy today.
How'd that work out on Penn
I
State,
got
Maine?
squashed like a grape. But that's what brings about the whole. That crisis of faith is so important. Erickson, Piaget, all these people, they talk about these stages you go through and you come to this critical moment where it's like, I could go this way or this way. I think everybody's got to reach that point in their faith where they're like, I got to choose, even in spite of all this. And that happened to me very early. And I got that out of the way so that I could kind of suck in all the alternative viewpoints, everything outside my own backyard. So then I could sit down with a Wiccan girl who's like, you wouldn't understand. You never read Wicca. And I'm like, I know Starbuck, like, let's do it. Like Starbucks, all these Wiccan authors and teachers. And, it's just, let's go for it,
And what that communicates is not that you're saying that everyone should go out and read these things, but it
No, everybody should right now. Just go immerse yourself.
What it communicates is the fact that you're not afraid.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes
not afraid to have the conversation. Just talk. Just listen. You can't be led astray just listening to somebody. Because if truth is true, then it's not going to be suddenly like, oh, we didn't think of that. Like God's not like, oh, crud. Yeah, you weren't supposed to hear that,
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely love that. So
I don't know what I just said. What did I say?
You said if God is true, then it shouldn't. You test it.
Yeah,
test it. God is true, and you're going to find that He is true.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of this whole like battleground, like they're over there, we're over here. And that's what I find more often than anything is people are like, all right, well, they hear an issue. They're like, well, who lines up on what side? Okay, so are my friends on this side? Okay, so then what do they think? Okay, so then I'm going to think these things. And it's like, that's not really pursuing the truth.
No.
So anyhow.
It's a disingenuous at best. So then you finished up, you got your doctorate in theology and you started working, you were in student ministry for a long time, young adult ministry for a long time. You've probably had dozens, hundreds of conversations with people of every walk of life. And the kind of conversations questions that come up in these kind of conversations are the ones we're going to hit today.
Oh, yeah.
These are the questions, and you helped me pick some of these questions, and there was like 10, 15 questions that we could have asked, but we're going to only look at a couple.
Yeah, we'll get through one. You're like, hey, let's get to 5. I'm like, wow.
Buckle
this
up.
is what conversations do. Like they've got to be rooted in like a back and forth. They can't be like, I believe this. What do you have to say?
Yeah, exactly. And so we're going to look at 3 or 4 of those questions that you've been asked most in these kind of conversations.
Yep.
And I would give the caveat that you really want, which is this is not to prepare you to crush your opponent like a grape.
Yeah. Come on, put this on double speed so we just get the argument.
Yeah. It's like, no, if you're not, it's the listening to the person and having a heart for the person that's on the other side of the conversation.
Right. Totally.
So John, you're sitting. I want you to imagine that you're sitting at a table with a young person that's wrestling with this question, and the question,
or an old one,
whoever it might be, and because we've all been there, John.
Yep.
And we've heard this question, and the question is, if there is a God, how can there be a God?
Yeah.
And have there be so much evil and wickedness in the world? You turn on the TV. Even in our own lives, there's just awfulness. Even in the Bible, you read some of the Old Testament, and it's like humans doing horrible things to humans. And then the last multiple thousands of years, like empires, destroying each other. And then in modern day, you have wars and you have horrible murders. And it's like all this stuff is evil.
Yep.
It's bad and it's happening. And so I think as any thinker is going to do is they're going to go either God is real and He lets this happen. And if He doesn't that make Him kind of a horrible jerk? Or God is, or you just simply say, well, then, or God's not real. And then I
Right.
don't have to I don't have to reconcile that. So what do you say to the person that's kind of thinking like,
Right. So again, what we've been talking about up to this point, it's like the urge is just to be like, destroy, you know, like
yeah,
I must seek and destroy this person's argument. And it's like, no, you want to draw it out. You want to, understand it a little more. So tell me more about that. Like, where are you coming from this? What's been your experience? One of my best questions is my favorite questions is to say like, so what's been your experience with this? Like what's been your faith experience? Where was the
love
point
that.
where did you actually, like early on in your life, did you go to church? Did you go to youth group, something like that? Was there a point which you kind of like fell off? And did you start to identify where it is that maybe this is, I don't know, almost like a smokescreen for something else, that this becomes an argument to support
So
something
they're
deeper.
like talking about evil in this world and that God
Yeah.
is absent, but maybe God was absent in their own life.
Yeah, and the evil was their youth pastor who told them like, you got to stop doing this or you're going to wind up in hell or something like that. Yeah.
There's some damage there
Yeah.
or some baggage that they're taking with. And so while they asked the generic question,
Right.
10,000 feet up, it originated in
Totally.
the heart of a 15-year-old that was hurt.
And so you're off here fighting the false war.
Yeah.
You're like battling all of these issues, and it's like that's not really the center point of where they're coming from. That's
You
not
almost
like
want to
ground
say
zero.
like you're saying, why does God allow evil? But you almost are like, no, maybe you're asking, why did God allow evil in my life?
Yeah, and finding out what that is. So it's a lot of asking questions, a lot of really just like poking and prodding. But it does eventually come to the point where the person will say, okay, so this was my personal situation. This is what happened to me. This is where evil showed up in my life. And we might get to that, but then they'll eventually get to the point, yeah, but I can't really put my faith in a God that would allow all these horrible things to happen. And this is where, and again, I'm going to ask you, like, is it cool if we like take some time on this because it's gonna, it takes a while to unpack. I would say, I think I have an issue with the idea of what you're talking about with evil. Okay, because if there really is evil in the world, I mean, you're telling me that there's something that you recognize that ought not to be. Okay, so obviously, in its most generic sense, evil is something that's not good. It's not what ought to be.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So the question is, where does that come from? And so again, this is a very, very kind of like preliminary type of addressing the deeper topic of who God is and atheism itself. But it's like saying, look, when we talk about evil, you're talking about something that's like extra. So for example, if all we are just animals, we're just evolved animals, which I don't agree that we're evolved animals. I'm sure you don't agree that we're evolved animals, but maybe there are some atheists out there that think that we're just evolved animals. And so like, if you think that we're evolved animals, where did this idea of what is good and evil come in? Where did that happen? And so it takes me back to Jane Goodall, Jane Goodall, right? Yeah. The animal behaviorists. So she lived with apes, gorillas. I know for a fact she worked with chimpanzees about 20 years ago. And as she was working with these chimpanzees, she named one of them Frodo. There's another movie, right? She was Lord of the Rings. She was watching Lord of the Rings. She really liked this one chimp and named him Frodo. And she said Frodo was kind of like a bully. He was a little bit aggressive, but she really liked him, And so again, this is a woman who spent decades becoming familiar with chimpanzees, with apes, gorillas, and was accepted into their clan, learned their behaviors and things like that. So she's working with this group of chimpanzees. I don't know how it's set up, but apparently somewhere in Africa, like pedestrians can walk past wherever they're working with chimpanzees, which I think is probably not a good idea. But this woman was walking by with her baby, and Frodo ran up and stole the baby. And I don't know how far you want to go into this, but it was gruesome what Frodo did to that baby. I mean, it wasn't just killing the baby; it was like completely like it was
evil.
Horrible.
It's horror.
100% evil. It's not just like, well, dropped her off as he was running. She knocked her head on the ground, or did horrible things to this baby. So that brought up a dilemma because there were, all kinds of people in the community were like, we got to put this chimp down, put a bullet in this chimp and destroy this chimp. I mean, obviously going to do it again. But then these animal behaviorists, they spoke up and they're like, no, back up. This chimp was only it was acting in its nature. And so it was never killed. It was never put down because it's acting the way it's supposed to act. So my question would be for Chad the atheist,
Yeah.
would be, so if all we are evolved chimps, apes, whatever, like we're cousins to the primates. If all we are is just this evolved animal, at what point in our history did ought or should have, you should do this, or what's good or evil, when did that enter into the spectrum of behavior? That's where I would start off. And again, this is like, there are many parts to this, but we're talking like couple lunches, couple coffees, whatever. We're just talking back and forth. But I would slowly spread this idea that, look, when you get rid of God, you get rid of ought. When you get rid of God, you get rid of this idea of what should be and good and evil. There just is. So we should live in a world right now that is very animalistic in nature if all we are is evolved animals. We should live in a world that's just like, well, so-and-so got murdered. That's just what people do.
So you're saying that to the antithesis of what even the premise of the question is, the premise of the question is if God isn't real, if God's not real, then the horrors of this world make more sense.
Right.
And you're saying actually,
so I'm saying
it's the fact that the horrors of this world are wrong is evidence
you're
that there is a
arguing
God.
from the other side. You're using someone else's currency. You know what I mean? You're arguing against God with the currency of Christian thought. You're dancing to the tune of grace or Christianity.
Because if there is no God, then YOLO.
How can you deconstruct God based on evil when all you are animals? So that's where I would start. And I'd say, well, we got a problem here because we can't say what's good or evil if we're just humans. So good and evil must have come from somewhere else. And then I would kind of progress a little bit further. And I'm not saying that, at this point with the atheist, I love how we're just like the atheist, like there's
any skeptic. There's a lot of skeptics.
All of them. But, they're not immediately going to be like, that's amazing. I totally agree. Of course they're not going to agree. And we live in a culture where it's going to be like, yeah, I don't agree with you, but let's move on. But there's still stuff that's ticking in there. I think the second thing I would bring up has to do with whether or not, on the subject of evil, whether it's, do you not believe in God or you just not like the way he works? And so it's the difference between like atheism and anti-theism. So an atheist doesn't believe in a God, but and this is, I'm just making this stuff up, but like an anti-theist is like someone who's against the way that God does his thing.
Yes.
So my question would be, is it really that there's no God, or you just don't like the idea that God would allow evil in a world? So why does that automatically say, well, there can't be a God just because there's evil in the world? And it's almost like, I just feel bad for God sometimes. Because it's like he can't do anything right. So we live in this world where evil is one of the outcomes of choice, right? Like we can choose what we want to do, and some people choose evil, some people choose good. But imagine you get into the multiverse thing. You've seen the Marvel movies, right?
Yeah.
Do your kids get in the Marvel stuff?
Oh, very much so.
So you sit down, you got your popcorn, you're watching like the madness of the multiverse. Or what was the Doctor Strange thing?
Yeah, I forget what.
Universe of madness of something. Multiverse.
Yeah, we watched that.
Everybody's talking about multiverses. No one uses it correctly, but it's so fascinating. It's like, well, in the multiverse, there's this. It's like, that's not
I'd like to think there's tens of thousands of Chads in the multiverse.
Right. Yeah. And it's like, okay, that's not exactly what the whole idea was for. But imagine there's a multiverse out there. Imagine there's a completely different universe where God does not allow anyone to act evil. Okay. So
yeah, that's what everyone would want.
Everybody would want that, right? Do you think that everybody wants this? This is where
I want that. That sounds amazing.
Everybody stops at that one thought, though. You can't stop at that one thought.
What do you
got
mean?
to keep going on that thought.
I love it. I want to live there.
No, you would complain.
Well,
You would
no,
complain.
I wouldn't.
God can't do the right thing ever. That's why I'm saying give God a day off. Okay. He just gets all this complaining. If we lived in a multiverse where God restricted human agency and said you can only do what's good, God would still be to blame. We'd all be like, oh, this is so wrong. It's like a simulation. There's no God. Like none of us can do anything. I guarantee you we would complain about that. I guarantee you. And then, okay, so let's make a third universe. Imagine a third universe where every time you did something that was sinful or wrong or evil, let's just say evil. Every time you did something that was evil, you get incinerated. Kind of like Thanos, like boom, you just turn to dust. So we get rid of the murderers, okay? We get rid of the rapists. We get rid of, the people that mess around with like kids and stuff. And it's like horrible stuff. We get rid of them. They're just gone. So what's the line?
What do you mean?
Where do we draw the line? Who gets evaporated and who doesn't get evaporated? We live in this multiverse, right? That now God's finally doing what we want to do, get rid of all the evil. So at what point am I getting evaporated? At what point are you getting evaporated?
Because what's evil to one isn't evil
I would
to
be
others.
dead by now. I would have been dead by like 8.
Yeah, who gets to make that decision?
Well, it's not even so much that, but like we're all evil.
Yeah.
Okay, so I rented a Tesla a couple weeks ago. I love Teslas. They're very expensive, and we were going on a trip somewhere. I'm like, well, it was. They made this deal where it was kind of cheap to rent a Tesla. I'm like, let's go for it. It was the dumbest decision because you got to like charge, and it takes forever. And then I got this bill like a week ago for like a lot of charging, and I was like, they never told me. But anyhow, so I'm in debt big time because of my Tesla venture. But that thing is pure speed. Have you ever been in a Tesla?
I have not.
You need to get in a Tesla. The blood goes to the back of your head. Like it is so fast. I'm serious. They've done these things. You look on YouTube, like they've done Tesla, Maserati, and Lamborghini, and it destroys them off the line. Like the quarter mile.
Why is that?
Destroys them because it's pure energy. I mean, there's no gears. You're not throttling up through anything. You just go.
Interesting.
So I'm on the highway, and this guy next to me, he's in this Audi, and you know, he's all like you can just tell it's pure speed as well, you know. And I'm on the highway, and Aiden's next to me, and I'm just driving, and I'm looking, and in my mind, I'm like, he's got the medallion and the toothpick and the glasses and the Ray-Bans, and he's like one of those Richie guys, is like, I own the road, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I want to destroy him. I just wanted to destroy him, you know. So he comes past me, he's flying past me. I hit the accelerator, and I was like in the next week. Like he was in my rearview mirror within like 2 seconds. And it was such a great feeling. You know, I was just like, I destroyed him. Got in the left lane, went past, got in the right lane, and then he passes me. And now we're doing like pass and pass, you know, that sort of thing. And I'm like, is this worth a ticket? It's probably not. You know, it's not worth a ticket. So we're going, it's just road rage back and forth, basically. And then like it got all congested, and he went ahead of me, and he looked at me, you know, he looked at me like, I win. So at that moment, I imagined like his car blowing up, you know, in my head.
Yeah.
So would I be incinerated then? That's evil. That's wrong.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't last. What's been your example of not lasting?
I think I'd be turned to dust about, you know, by 9 a.m. every day.
Yeah.
And, you know, just by the sheer, my natural nature is selfish.
Yeah.
Like the very nature of Chad is me.
Right.
And I think that means that left to my own devices, I would choose me over you every day of the week. Without God in my life, there'd be no reason I wouldn't make, you know, horrible choices. And that would, if in your picture of God eviscerating or disintegrating anyone that is evil, that would be me.
So we've got 3 universes, right? We got this universe where evil is allowed for choice, and then we can choose God. Yeah. You got this second universe where like everybody's robots, and you got this third universe where people get like completely destroyed, you know, if they're sinful or whatever.
Sure.
In every universe, we're complaining. In every universe, we're saying God's to blame. And so really it's like, is it really about not believing in God, or is it more about not agreeing with the way he runs things?
Interesting.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. And I do wonder if a lot of people that are atheist or skeptical, it really does come down to that it's not that I don't believe there's a God, I just don't like him.
Yeah. I don't like the way he's running this present universe, the way he's doing it, which brings me to the third point. So if we can get to that point and be like, okay, I can see that. I can understand that it's really not about whether or not I agree with God. This one question has more to do with how he's running things and whether I agree with the way he's running things.
So to recap, the first 2 points of your answer to the question of why is there evil, why would God allow evil? You basically, first part you said was to even understand that there's evil, you have to first understand that there's good, and that, you know, you're using God language.
Mhm.
By even saying that there's evil and there's good, you're basically acknowledging that there's a God that helps you
Yeah.
separate the difference and
Right.
separates us from the chimpanzees.
Yeah, the first point is basically saying like, look, if you're going to say something's evil, then you got to accept that there's something good, because you can't have evil in a world that's just kind of like, well, we just act this way.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then the second point you were basically talking about is sometimes people mix up the idea that there's no God. In actuality, what they're feeling is they're angry to
Yeah,
God.
so much of the evil argument has to do with like, I don't like the fact that God allows evil. So I get that,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean he doesn't exist.
Yeah.
There's a big difference there.
Yeah.
And so getting a person to realize that like, okay, well, maybe it's not so much that I disagree with the fact that God could possibly exist, but actually I just disagree with God. I just don't like the way he's running things. It's a whole lot different than saying there is no president of this company versus I don't like the way he's running this company. That's a very big difference.
And again, the original question is, why would God allow, if God is real, why would he allow evil? So
Which comes down to the third thing, which really has a lot to do with love. And so when we talk about love, and love, obviously it's much more than just a feeling. It's a decision. It's a decision to love somebody for a lifetime, to have their highest good. You're married. You've been married how long?
21 years, Steph and I.
To Steph? Yeah, you're married, man.
She's a saint.
That's amazing. I mean, do you ever think of that? I honestly, like, I just got a text from my wife about an hour ago, and she's like, how's your day? And like, I don't know, just the simple thing of like, there's someone out there who's thinking of me, who's committed to me for a life. That's a big deal.
That is a big deal.
That's a huge deal. And, like after how many, decades or whatever. So, you love your wife. Is there anything that she does that you're like, oh, I wish she would just stop doing that?
Oh, other than being amazing.
That's good. You know what you're doing.
Sometimes she's too amazing and she makes my life too much better.
That's good. That's good. So imagine you could make her into a robot that does whatever you wanted to do. Anytime you wanted to do whatever you wanted to do. She couldn't be like, no, Chad, we're not watching High School Musical again. She can't do that.
Yep.
She can't do that.
Yeah, I got a fever. The only cure is more Zac Efron in High School Musical.
I totally imagine at the Herman household, it's Frozen 3.
Yeah.
Is there a 3?
No.
Frozen 2, High School Musical, Titanic. Am I hitting them?
No, you're all wrong. You're all wrong. It's a lot of Marvel.
Gorillas in the Mist.
Actually, ironically, this is why it's so funny. Parker and I have been watching Planet of the Apes. So as you're talking,
Jane Goodall documentaries.
As you're talking, I'm literally like, yeah,
excellent.
I can see this happening.
Okay, so imagine
Frodo.
like anything you're picturing it. Anything you could imagine, like you're like, I just want this to happen. So you could snap your fingers and be like, hey, Steph, guess what? It's time to do the dishes. She'd be like, yes. And she'd go do them. Or like, it's your turn to pick up the kids. Or like, she couldn't say no to you.
She's a robot.
Yeah, exactly. Like she couldn't not choose you.
So how long does this last?
So for as long as you want, how long would it take before you got bored?
It'd be a minute.
I want to hear dates. Like, how long would it take?
I think at least a week would be fun.
Yeah,
that'd be fun. maybe a month.
Yeah.
So but I see what you're getting at. You're saying eventually.
I think I'd go 2 years. I mean, honestly, before 2 years up, I would get really bored of that because obviously you're saying like, okay, well, this isn't real. Like it's programmed. But I'd enjoy it.
Yeah.
I'd enjoy it. Let's go rock climbing. Let's go to the Grand Canyon.
She does whatever you want it to do.
Totally, 100% of the time. Yeah. But that's why when you can't not choose someone, then that's not really love. And so
I see where you're going.
That is the byproduct of love is choice. Choice always has to be in the equation. I mean, there's some serious stuff that happens in Genesis chapter 1. If you write off Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3, okay, if you write them off as just poetry, you're missing something super deep here. I mean, there is heavy, heavy stuff. Genesis chapter 3 is filled with stuff where God is saying, look, I'm giving you a choice. I mean, that's deep. He's like, look, I've created everything here. Everything in this entire world is for you. And look, I've made this garden where there's all kinds of trees. There's trees of all kinds of stuff. And again, if you're saying this is poetry, this happens again in Revelation. It shows up again in Revelation. This isn't poetry. This is real stuff.
Wow.
So he says, hey, there's even the tree of life is in the garden, and there's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Not the tree of good and evil, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So basically what God's doing is he's setting himself up saying like, hey, if you want to know what's right or wrong, just come to me. Okay. Don't go to it for yourself. Come to me. And I can give you advice. I can suggest of what to do, but it's your choice.
Wow.
And that's a heavy, heavy thing because basically at some point, God withdrew his hand and said, I'm not going to affect the outcome of this. I think God knew the outcome, but he didn't ordain the outcome. He didn't will it to happen. He said there was a point in Genesis 3, this is why it's so heavy, where humans were able to make a choice. And because they were able to make a choice, then that means they were able to freely love. If we had chosen to listen to God, there was always that episode of like, well, we could have chosen no, and we didn't. We're not robots.
Yeah.
We chose. And so choice brings about the chosen. And what's interesting in all of that is love can't exist where there's a lack of choice. And because love can't exist where there's a lack of choice, then the automatic byproduct of that episode there is the potential for evil.
Because they can choose evil.
Right.
Which is some of what I've heard from other, Christians about this subject is the brokenness of this world. I often hear that as a line when proposed with this question.
Mm-hmm.
And it's overly simplistic, but it does kind of hit at the point of what you're making, which is God loved us enough to allow us to choose.
Right.
And part of that choice is choosing his way and following him and choosing good, but also part of it is choosing to diverge from him and
100%.
Choosing evil.
And if you play out all of the multiverse of, like, let's try two other ways. You're a robot, you get incinerated for your evil. That doesn't work. That's not love. One's like a police state. The other is just robotic.
Wow. I really do get what you're saying, John.
Right.
So you're basically saying is like, one, God was darned if he did and darned
if he did, darned if he didn't. And he needs a day off.
So, but he chose the most loving thing.
Yeah.
Because he could have chose the robot thing. He could have chose the incineration thing.
Right.
He chose the love thing.
Right.
And because he chose the love thing, evil gets to happen.
Evil is the gamble in the choice of true love. It is something that comes out of as a possibility when you have an actual choice.
Wow.
That's heavy.
That is heavy.
So it takes a while to get there. You have to walk through some of these things. But hopefully you get to the point where the whole thing of like, why does God allow evil? It's backward. It's like, why didn't we listen? It's like we're standing in a house that we just set on fire and goes, why did you let me do this? That's not the question. The question is, why did we set it on fire to begin with? Like, why did we choose to not listen to him? So like, God didn't invade Ukraine. God didn't bring down the two towers. That was humans. The evil is us. And so through a long set of conversations, you can come to this point is that, man, God created a masterpiece at creation. And through sin, basically, we just graffitied all of it.
Wow. And
so what's God going to do with that? He's going to, over time, through patience, bring about justice one day. And that's one of the questions we want to answer later about like judgment and like, why does God judge? But that is a huge component of all this is that God is not just up there going like, well, I'll just let this keep going and let evil keep happening. Yeah. I love how Martin Luther King, he's talking about civil rights. So it is in the context of human rights, but he has this quote where he says, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And so there's this idea that God has in mind a long-term, like we are going to bring about judgment day, but I'm going to let it last for a long time because as we eventually bend toward justice, that allows more and more people to choose to follow me versus to choose evil and to choose Christ versus to choose themselves or humanism or atheism or whatever it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So it's kind of like we have to remind ourselves that God has a plan, and then God is working on that plan.
Now, what do you say to the person that diverges like a little bit, and they're the person that is trying to do good apart from God?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the person that's saying, like, I can do good, I can bring about good, I can bring about change, I can bring about goodness in this world, but I don't need God to do it.
Yeah, I don't know if that really answers the whole question of why is there evil in the world, though? You know what I mean? Because
because there you got to remind them, like, you're changing the question.
Yeah, so that's a different set of, like, can I do good things to earn God's favor? That's a great question, but that's not why is there evil in the world. And I actually brought Matthew chapter 13. I love Jesus' parable. This is a heavy parable. This is one of my favorite parables of Jesus because it's like spooky. Okay, so Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 to 29, Jesus is going through a series of these parables. And he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a farmer who planted good seed in his field. But that night, as the workers slept, his enemy came and planted weeds among the wheat and then slipped away. I love that. When the crop began to grow and produce grain, the weeds also grew. The farmer's workers went to him and said, Sir, the field where you planted the good seed is full of weeds. Where'd they come from? And I love this line. An enemy has done this, the farmer exclaimed. So, he's surveying this field. He sees he planted good wheat, but now there's weeds, and an enemy has planted the weeds in here. And so the farmer's hands come up to him and they said, should we pull out the weeds? Should we get rid of evil? And look what he says. He says, no, he replied, you'll uproot the wheat if you do. Isn't that fascinating? Wow. So when we talk about evil, there is a plan. And God is basically telling us, I think through this parable, is that, hey, there's a lot that's interconnected here. And I love the fact that God has a redemption plan, and then he planted wheat, right? And there are weeds that are growing up. But in the middle of that, there is the arduous task, the long task, that moral arc of the universe task type of thing that, like, it's much longer than our lives. God's justice is longer than a soundbite. It's longer than a week, a month. It's longer than our lives. That God is working toward this time in which he will eventually judge evil.
Yeah.
But we can't lose sight of, like, God is working toward that. And if he were to just go ahead and uproot everything right now, some of us would be affected by that. There are people who are in progress right now that are coming to Jesus. If he were to snap his fingers and bam, like, that's done. So that's all off in a
good.
different category. But those are my three responses when I think through, like, so why does God allow evil in the world? It's like, it's such a big question.
So it's basically, the origins of how you even know what evil is.
Mm-hmm.
It's the what would you say the second? How would you bullet point all three of these just to
It's
summarize?
hard to bullet point it, honestly.
Yeah.
It's more like you just want to walk them through to this final point of, like, God chose to give us choice. And because he gave us choice, that means some people are not going to choose good. They're going to choose evil. And so why does God allow evil in the world? Because he's at work changing it. It's long. It's messy. But I would rather, out of the three options, right? Out of the three options, I would rather not live in a Nazi police state where it's like, oh man, Chad just thought an impure thought. He's gone,
Yeah.
I would rather not live where it's like, good morning, it's wonderful, I love you. I'd hate that. I'd rather be in this messy state where we can have grace, where God can be real to us, or we can choose to just completely ignore it and go our own way.
And what I love,
but that's not atheism. That's anti-theism. That's saying, like, I don't agree with you, God. I want to do my own thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you help me understand the difference, and I think most people are probably anti-theism.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that, it's one of those questions that burns, and I think people, the way you handled the question, John, was really respectful, and you handled it through appreciating that they were intellectually, honest. They were saying, I don't tell me that the reality of this world is as it should be,
right?
And don't tell me that it shouldn't be better,
right?
And don't.
You're right.
There's
evil stuff that goes on, and how can a good God let that happen? Well, it's a messy answer.
Yeah,
it's a hard answer,
but it's an answer that is, the question deserves a hard answer.
Yeah. But I mean, think about it. So many people, especially Christians, I think sometimes they think to themselves like, well, I don't know if I can really trust anything unless I fully understand it, unless I completely get all the answers. And it's like, has God ever worked that way in our lives at all?
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Did God sit down with us before we were born and was like, okay, let me just tell you what's going on here. Okay. I'm going to put you inside a woman. Okay. And you're going to be pushed out, and that's your mom. Okay. And then you're going to be an idiot for the first 2 years. You're not going to have any control over your bowels. You're going to fall down a lot. You're not going to know language. Like if you heard all that stuff, you'd be like, wait, I don't want to do this. No, it's fine. And then, when you're older, you're going to have school. There's going to be friends. Some people will beat you up. And you're going to have nightmares. You'd be like, I don't think I want this, Sometimes you're going to think it's a great day. Sometimes you're not. And then you're going to go through puberty. Then everything's going to change.
Yeah, that's easy.
Everything's going to change. And then maybe someday you'll wind up lucky enough to find somebody to share your life with, and you'll have babies of your own. You'll figure out death. So did we cover everything? Are you ready to be born? Like, no, you had to figure it out as you went.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of this is just figuring it out as we go, and we just trust Christ and listen to what people's questions are, for sure.
Okay, so next question that I hear predominantly, because we as Christians, we proof text with the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So when there's tough questions, we often utilize the Bible for the source of our answers.
Yep.
It is God's word, it's living and breathing, and we as Christians, it is an authority in our lives. Now, with that said, I think a lot of people that are atheist or skeptical are going to go, the very thing you're getting your evidence from is flawed. And it's flawed because the Bible was written by humans.
Right.
It was written by humans. And so they concocted this God, and you're using the very fiction that they concocted in this book to prove that there's a God that they invented. And so how do you start that conversation with someone? And even the premise of the question was a little hostile, but
no, I love it.
I do think that's
I think it's great.
That's kind of how it's set up.
It's a great question because it's totally like this conspiracy theory movie. It's like, remember that? It's like an ancient movie, Da Vinci Code.
Oh my gosh, with Tom Hanks.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a guy. I love so many of his movies.
Yeah.
He's a great actor.
Yeah, he was Turner and Hooch. He was really good. It was great.
Yeah.
So
Citizen Kane and Turner and Hooch.
Bosom Buddies. Wasn't he in Bosom Buddies?
Yes, that was the old TV show.
Was that Bosom Buddies?
Yes,
or was that,
Bosom
what was the other one with Larry Baltakamus?
That was Perfect Strangers.
Perfect Strangers. Yeah. It's a ripoff of
all 90s, 80s and 90s
80s.
TV.
Yeah. That's ancient. So I think back to some of those old movies, like of the dusty catacombs of like ancient European men that are like coming up with the Illuminati and constructing these secret organizations, these cabals all over the world that are having us bow to their shrines and statues.
Definitely sounds like a good movie.
You know what I mean? I think the internet is full of really interesting ideas of like, so this is how the Bible was written. You had these people from thousands of years ago that were evil, and they knew that they would have this worldwide movement one day and they'd make all this money and influence. I was listening to a friend of mine, I was listening to this podcast, and the guy was like, so Jesus was actually a revolutionary and he just wanted to reform Judaism. And then when he died, Paul came along and he kind of did like a marketing thing and thought, okay, how is this going to appeal to the masses, and changed everything Jesus did and made it into this mass product of like, okay, everybody's going to really click with like eternal life and grace and loving people and stuff like that. And so he changed it into this religion that looks nothing like what Jesus talked about.
Interesting.
Which is so full of baloney. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm trying to think of like, how do we say this? It's horrible history. I mean, it's terrible exegesis of anything, historical or even scriptural. These guys were not mega church pastors. They didn't drive Beamers and Mercedes. They didn't get book deals. They weren't in hotel suites. They had no clue this would be a worldwide movement. They had no idea that there would be a Catholic church or anything like that. they were convinced that Jesus was returning within decades, if not within any minute. And that's why they didn't write stuff down immediately, because he said, preach it. The word there is kerygma, which means preach it, talk about it. He doesn't say write it down.
Wow.
And most people listened. They didn't read. So that's why they took like 20, 30 years to write this stuff down, because they were preaching everywhere. So what's fascinating about all of that, though, is that if they were, that podcast, a friend of mine's podcast, who was like, yeah, Paul just changed it into something that would appeal to the masses. That's the worst marketing move ever, okay? Ever.
Go on.
The book of John starts off with Jesus becoming the Word who became flesh, right? The Greeks would have shut that scroll immediately and been like, that's blasphemy. You know, like they thought that gods and humans were different, and like anything that was of the noumenal realm, anything beyond of this sphere was no way could they be tainted by anything that was of this earth. Socrates talked about being chained into the prison house of the soul, that the spirit is waiting to get out of anything physical. So the idea of a God becoming man, they would have laughed at. The Romans, they would have been like, wait, so your savior died on a cross? Like, he was weak. Like, Tom Holland writes a really good book called Dominion. It's about Roman
Spider-Man?
Civilization. Yeah, that guy. Different Tom Holland. Yeah, much different. This Tom Holland writes like 5-sentence long sentences. But it's a good book, though, because it talks about how in Roman culture, if you were to say Jesus died for you or sacrificed himself, that whole idea of sacrifice was weak. You know, like if you had a friend and they're like, well, I'm feeling kind of like vulnerable about this. It was kind of like the Roman culture to be like, okay, how can I take advantage of that? How can I exploit that?
Yeah.
So they were real deal. So this whole premise of Jesus dying on a cross would not have appealed to them. They would have been like, your savior died. It's weak. And of course, the Jews were like, this is blasphemy. There's only one God, and it's God alone. And how can the law become, the word of God now becomes a person? And so it's another God. And then, John completes his volume with women realizing the resurrection, which again, back then, women couldn't even give testimony in court. So it's a horrible, horrible way to try to appeal to the masses.
So I think I see where you're going here. Is the authors of the Bible, the authors, especially the ones that you're describing, the authors of the New Testament, if they were creating works of fiction, they weren't doing so that was going to really spread easily.
It was the complete opposite of what would have spread easily. Yeah. And it would appeal to people that were not, high-ranking officials or whatever. The early church was filled with people who were lame, crippled, the outcasts of society.
So how does this prove that
well, it's one step. Again, this is all like conversation, So people are going to say, well, these guys, they knew they were trying to manipulate what happened to Jesus. Really, Jesus didn't rise from the dead. They just said it would appeal to a wide audience. We've already shown that it wouldn't have appealed to a wide audience at all. It would have actually restricted their audience. But they were like, I don't know what to tell you. I just saw this happen. All I got to say is this happened to me. And then, you got to kind of go on a little bit further with that is all of those guys died for their faith.
Horrifically.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, one would kill himself. Judas killed himself. One would die by crucifixion upside down. One was probably killed in India. One was beaten to death by the Romans. One was stabbed to death in Africa. One was beheaded. One was killed in Iran. And one was burned to death. And then the other one just died an old man in exile in Patmos. So these guys all died for their faith. So if this was a lie, why did all 12 of these guys, 11 of them, Judas is an exception because he killed himself, but why would all these guys go to their death for something that was clearly untrue? And it was just made up about something. Chuck Colson has a really good quote. Remember Chuck Colson from Watergate, right? You remember that? Remember we were
As you do.
over there in Watergate. That's a long time ago.
Watergate? Yeah.
Yeah. That's like
50 years?
Yeah. It's a while back.
To say, yeah.
And then everybody just keeps calling everything gate, like deflate gate and like this gate and that gate. Everything that's a problem now becomes a gate.
This is the first time I realized that.
Yeah, it's true.
It all came from a hotel name.
Watergate. Yeah. Anyhow, Chuck Colson, he says, I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. So Watergate was where, they went in and they spied out all of the plans on the opponent in the presidential race. They were trying
Richard
to get
Nixon, his campaign was spying on their opponent.
So these guys went in there. They're like former Navy SEALs. They were like hardened dudes. They were not weak-kneed people. They went in there and they were trying to get an advantage for Nixon in the election, right? And he says, well, Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men, he's talking about the disciples, 12 men testified that they'd seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. And then he goes on to compare that to Watergate. He says, Watergate had 12 of the most powerful men in the world at the time, okay? And they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. They cracked under pressure. So you're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolute impossibility, he says. So I think that's really fascinating. And I mean, you're just talking about common like fishermen versus people that were former Navy SEALs who were used to this kind of grilling under pressure, and they all gave up within 3 weeks.
Wow. So
that all kind of forms a little bit of the background behind so where did this all start? So it all started with these 12 very common people who went out to preach, 11 that went out to preach it and talk about it. And it was not something that was for the masses, something that was going to appeal to the masses. But I think what you're getting at, though, is so what happened in the transmission of that, right? How do we know over the next 2,000 years? How do we know and what do you hear most?
Well, even in the fact that, you have these men that, they preached it, they wrote some things down. It was 300 years before it became the Bible. So there were still humans. There's still human hands choosing and picking and collecting. And so I think there's some people that are still saying humans, how can you trust the divine when transcribed by human hands?
Yeah, it's interesting. There is no point in time where God comes out of heaven and goes, here's the Bible. Here is the New Testament. I'm only taking these things. And they had to do their best of saying let's come up with 5 criteria. So they came up with 5 criteria that included people who actually witnessed Jesus, things that actually jibe with the rest of the Bible. That it was actually so there's these 5 sets of criteria that they do to actually come up with what do we accept as what they call the canon. But over the years of Jesus' resurrection and then sending out of the church, you see all of these accounts that pop up. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And what's fascinating is you see echoes of this even outside the Bible. So yeah, you're right. There's no okay, here's the Bible within the first century. But there are thousands and thousands of copies. There are 6,000 Greek copies of the New Testament that are floating around all through Jerusalem that all agree with each other. And if you count outside of the Greek language, there's 25,000 copies that are circulating all through the ancient world.
And what time is this?
This is the early, from the time of the resurrection up to the first 300-400 years of the church.
Wow! So
it's insane to think that we have so much manuscript evidence of the Gospels.
That's fascinating. So you're saying basically,
the earliest copy of John is 140. The earliest fragment of John is 140. And the things that we see in there, it accords with the stuff of 300-400 AD.
And then you have other things like the Dead Sea Scrolls that prove that it had lasted,
That's the Old Testament. Yeah.
Yeah, but that God's word had lasted uncorrupted.
Yeah. The Dead Sea Scrolls, I know we don't have time for it right now, but it would be fun to do an episode on that because it is freaky how well the Old Testament stands up to scrutiny over 1,100 years time. There's virtually no change. So that's an insane story in itself.
It's almost it's there was no point in time where God wasn't holding its hand.
Yeah. Yeah. So. And yet it's not God doesn't step out of heaven and say, here's the Bible. Okay, this is the thing. That's Islam. Okay, so there's a big difference. Islam, the gift of God to humanity in Islam is the Quran. Okay. And it's completely in the theology of Islam, it is uncorrupted. It's in the original text. God gave it to us. It is the thing we venerate, essentially. The gift that God gave to the world in Christianity is Jesus. And there's a big difference. And I love the wisdom of God of not making the Bible into something we worship. And that's where it gets slippery, though. It's like, well, then, man, well, how much do you give the Bible in terms of its credibility so that it becomes something we can relate to or at least trust, but not so much so that we say, well, this is a gift straight from God. We ought to worship it.
Wow.
I had a roommate.
So you're saying the human authorship it compounds on the fact that God didn't want it to be. God wanted it to be a roadmap, not a deity.
Yeah. And okay, so this gets to something later we probably want to talk about, but for so many years, I would say to myself, why didn't Jesus come during the video age? Why didn't he come when we had camcorders or at least phones? Remember camcorders? Like,
I love that you were like, why didn't Jesus come when there was VHS?
Yeah,
it's like
Betamax.
But all the world has cell phones now.
Yeah, but listen to me. That truth only lasts for maybe a couple decades because now we've got AI and everything can be manipulated. Even video, we're like, oh, that's fake. Wow. Isn't that wild?
Oh, that's true.
Think of the wisdom of God of not putting it in the video age because 1,000 years from now, people will be like, yeah, well, that was like,
fake news.
Yeah. So it doesn't last. Man is fickle. And no matter what medium we put it in, it is always going to be attached with some sort of, that was a bunch of guys just wrote stuff down. See, the thing is, this is what's so fascinating to me is that Jesus had 12 disciples. He told them the truth. They had disciples. They told them, all the way down to us, to some guy on the beach in Ocean City talking to me about Jesus. I mean, do you ever think about that?
Wow.
Do you know how many generations that is? That's 80 generations. So I'm a link in the chain. I'm link number 80 in the generations of people just talking to each other that came to me. And we see this even outside the Bible. Okay. Yeah. So outside the Bible, there's a really fascinating thing. So Jesus had John as a disciple. I'm hopping all around here.
You're fine.
Jesus had John as a disciple, right? John had a bunch of disciples. All the disciples had a group of disciples. So John had a bunch of disciples. One of them was Polycarp. And Polycarp had a disciple named Irenaeus. What's fascinating is that we have some of Irenaeus's writings. And Irenaeus talks about listening to Polycarp talk about John and the risen Savior and the person that came and did miracles. This is outside the Bible. So, I mean, think about this for a minute. I have a quote right here. It says, I'm able to describe the very place in which the blessed Polycarp sat as he discoursed in his goings out and his comings in and his manner of his life and his physical appearances and his discourses to the people and the amounts to which he gave of the intercourse with John and the others who had seen the Lord. Isn't that wild? Like, we know outside of the Bible itself that this happened, Yeah. And so, like, that guy told, So Polycarp sat down and talked to Irenaeus. Irenaeus wrote this down in his memoirs, right? I just told you, we've just skipped 80 generations.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
And what he was writing down, it's like someone recalling from the 1970s something.
Because it was that recent.
Yeah. So I was born in 1972. Okay. So I remember the 70s. I remember like the Sixers. I remember the Phillies and like different things that happened in the 70s. I remember the bicentennial in Philadelphia. It was like a big deal. I remember when 1980, when it came about, I was like, wow, a new decade. I can think of some of those things and I can recall stuff from back there. If some dude died and rose again and I was like 8 years old, I'd be like, wow, I would remember that. So it's not like stuff that's all fairy tale. For these guys, it was real, and they're passing it along in their memoirs. So, I mean, there's lots more evidence you can give to the scriptures themselves. Previously I talked about how there's like 25,000 copies of the New Testament. When you look at like some of the most ancient works that we trust, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, like Homer's works, we say, no, the stuff we have, we know it is trustworthy, it's true. We only have like 1,600 copies of those. And the span between when it was actually written and the earliest copy is about 1,600 years.
Wow.
But we don't doubt that. But the Bible, we have 25,000 copies, and the span from when it happened to when it was our first written occurrence of it is 80 years. And yet we got all these questions.
That's fascinating.
Come on. Come on. Okay. So, I think it's fascinating. You think, so why did God give us a 2,000-year-old book? I think no matter what he gave us, we're going to be, it's the cynic, we're all going to be like, yeah, well, even if God gave us video, be like, yeah, AI. Yeah. It's manipulated. Somebody along the way.
So you're basically saying in the end, the people that are like, I want the scientific proof for God, I want the evidence, nothing is going to satisfy.
Isn't that funny? Now think about that. Why isn't it satisfying?
I think I'm just guessing that the root of it is a faith component.
Yeah. Isn't that weird? God seems to be the two big predispositions I see to God in the scripture over and over again is a predisposition toward the poor and then a predisposition toward those who are unlearned, humble, and open to faith. Isn't that wild?
Yeah.
Over and over again, you see like in Isaiah, you see in 2 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, where it's like God has revealed this to the lowly and the humble, and he's hidden it from the wise. Now you got to be careful about that because then you can just like take advantage of people, but there's something in there. There's a component to that isn't just like beautiful. It's just interesting. It's like, why does God choose a person who wants to see it on faith? I think of Ray Bradbury, one of my favorite authors. He's a science fiction writer. Do you know?
Star Trek, right?
That's Roddenberry, right? Gene Roddenberry. Ray Bradbury, he wrote like Fahrenheit 451. He wrote Martian Chronicles, Something Wicked This Way Comes. So one of my favorite books is Martian Chronicles. And basically, you got to read this book. It's so great. Every chapter is like a different short story. It's only like 10 pages. So it's like you feel like you've read a whole book. So every chapter is an example of showing up on Mars and what happens, So there's this guy and every story is not related to each other, So one of the chapters, this guy shows up on Mars and he finds Martians, but they're like human-like. So he's like, that's so weird. We thought they'd be like Martian-like or something. So he starts talking to them. He can't believe he's talking to them. And they're not interested in him showing up. He's like, don't you understand? I just come from the earth. Okay, this is a big deal. And they're like, yeah, that would have been a big deal. But the master is here. And he's coming at 3:00. So we're getting ready for him. And he's like, who's the master? He's like, oh, the master. The master, he heals people. He tells us what's true. He loves us with an infinite love. And so he's like, I got to find this man. It sounds like Jesus. Like, what's this? And he's talking to his crew and they're like, man, sounds interesting. So he's like, yeah, tell me more about this master. I'm like, yeah, he's coming at 3:00. He's like, yeah, well, tell me more about him. Like, well, how do I know I can believe in him? Oh, well, he does these amazing things. Well, show me what he's done. And they show him this guy like, yeah, look at his arm. It's completely healed. And he's like, yeah, but what was it before? He's like, well, it was not healed. And he goes, yeah, but how do I know that? And he's like, because I just told you. So the guy's like, yeah, but you could be lying to me. And they looked at him like, why would he lie to you? So he's like, well, because that's what people do. And he's like, yeah. He's like, well, look. And they show him a painting. This is when he was 12. Look what his arm was. It's like, that's a painting. Anybody can mess with a painting. And then it says, everybody looked at him differently after that. And they're like, oh, okay. So they put the painting away. They're like, yeah. Maybe the master might not show up at 3:00. And so he's like, what? He's like, well, where's he going to be? I'm like, I don't know. Maybe try on the other side of the planet. So he's like, yeah, I got to find this guy. I'm going to go. And so he like gets in the thing. He takes off. And then all the townspeople come together and some of the crew actually stayed behind. And they're like, why did you do that? And he's like, he'll never believe. No matter what, he's always going to be asking questions. And they lead the rest of the crew into like seeing the master. It's a fascinating story, which really gets to the heart of what you're asking. It's saying like, are there just some things that we need to ask questions. We need to push and say like, all right, so what's going on here? But there just comes a point where we say, okay, so the questions are done. What am I going to do with this? And so that's why when we meet with atheists and we talk with people who are far from faith, spend a long time getting into all this. But there's a point in time where you say, so what are you going to do with this? What do you say?
That is, dude, I was literally on the edge of my seat.
Isn't that a fascinating story?
Listening to you tell this story.
That's such a good story. You got to read that book. It's really good. I mean, part of it's like, okay, did Jesus show up on Mars? I'm not saying Jesus showed up on Mars. I want to be like orthodox here. Like, did you see a podcast? John's talking about Martian Jesus. You know, there's no Martian Jesus.
Nope.
It's
Don't
just
take that out of
fiction.
context.
Okay, yeah.
So last question we have time for is this idea that the condemnation or how can God, a loving God, allow half the people or 75% of the people, or all the people that don't choose to believe that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior,
right? How
can God condemn them to an eternity in hell? Like how? And again, it goes back to this loving God, and how can God condemn people? Yeah, and how can this you speak? So I'll just ask the question as it might be asked. You talk about a loving God, but like he's literally going to send, my whole family to hell because they don't believe in Jesus. Yeah. Yeah. And I start off on that. I'm like, hey man, you're right. Yeah. That's horrible. And I don't really qualify it quickly. That sounds terrible. And then I just sit with it and be like, yeah, I don't like that idea either. But one of the things after I say, so what's your history with this question? You know what I mean? Like what's your background? Where are we coming from on this? I think so many Christians just got to be like, stop attacking the argument and start embracing the arguer and say like, okay, so where are you coming from on this? Like, where's this question come from? And then after we explore that for a little bit, let me tell you my experience with this question too, because I don't like this question either. But there's something about, in most Christians, we tend to, on issues like this, we go to chapter and verse when we ought to be going to the person of Jesus. You know what I mean? Like, it's like we're going to analyze or dissect a text rather than say, well, let's talk about Jesus for a minute, okay? So you're saying at the end of the world, if there are people who never heard of Jesus, they're going to stand in front of the great white throne of judgment and just be like, I never heard of you, Now think about this for a minute. So there's Jesus, right? And it's personal for me in a sense, because I think of the scene of Jesus, how he was betrayed by his own, that he was marched into a trial that was rigged, okay? Listen, that trial, that wasn't a trial. That wasn't an execution. No. That was a murder, because it was a mistrial on so many fronts. I mean, John MacArthur has a great book on the murder of Jesus, where he unpacks about how the high priest wasn't allowed to talk. That was the fact that the high priest spoke up was a miscarriage of justice. They should have wiped out the trial. The fact that two witnesses couldn't agree, they should have declared a mistrial. On capital offenses, if you decided to kill somebody, you had to wait a full course of like day and night, reconvene, and then decide. I also heard even the fact that it took place at night. Yes. Yeah. There's like 12 things that they completely violated. So you have injustice that's going on. He's up all night. They're smacking him around. They're mistreating him. And then they march him out in front of all these people that have obviously been rigged. They're all told to, you're going to say this, right? They're manipulated. And he's handed over to the Romans. They deal with him unjustly. And I mean, man, think about that. He's standing on the ledge in front of all these people, and they're all screaming out, Barabbas, Do you think that same person is going to sit there on the throne on the judgment day and look at somebody going, I never even heard of you, and be like, stinks to be you? Do you think that? Do you really think that Jesus is going to be like, I know, that's the way the cookie crumbles? Like, not a chance. And so it's funny because it's like, well, what chapter and verse? No. This is Jesus. Like, we know Jesus. We know that his sense of justice is so much more powerful than our sense of justice, so much more infinite than our sense of justice. And when you see in Revelation where it says,
every knee will bow, every tongue confess. We always think of that scene as coerced, like people are like, ugh, I confess that you're Lord. I think that's a scene of convincing, like, oh, you are clearly Lord of the universe. I can't deny it. And so people come to that point saying like, I agree. I know who you are. And so that to me speaks volumes of the justice of Jesus. And obviously, when you look through the New Testament, you look through the Old Testament, how basic theology will walk you through the whole idea of like everything we see declares the glory of God. And there's no way, no one has an excuse when it comes to like not knowing Jesus. So I never lose any sleep on whether or not people are going to go to hell unjustly, because God's sense of justice is infinitely greater than mine. Do I have all the blueprints? Do I have all of the subtext and the codex and this and that and whatever on how that's going to happen? Not a chance. No.
Yeah.
But I trust that God is good. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, that just seems basic to me.
A friend of ours, Dave Detweiler, he coined this. He said it this way. He said, the mere fact that you feel it's unfair is an example of something hardwired into you from God.
Yeah. Yeah. And see, all of that, though, is just the start. So again, all of these just started like the ground assault, the beginning of this. And we start with words like, is God immoral to do this, or does he condemn people? And again, I think this has more to do with anti-theism versus atheism, because you say like, well, like, I don't like that God judges people. So you want God to affirm and support everyone? You want God to affirm and support everyone? I don't think you do. Cliff Knechtle has a great point. He was with, what's that guy? Logan Paul.
Oh, the boxer?
Yeah. What's that podcast? Is Paulson?
I have no idea.
Impulsive. That's what it's called.
That's a great name.
I think it's called, I don't know. It's a big thing. It's impulsive. But anyhow, that's worth looking at, because he had a great back and forth with Logan Paul. Logan Paul was very, very respectful, and it seemed like he was really tracking a lot with what he was saying. But Knechtle says this to him. He goes, hey, I heard you're having a baby. And he goes, yeah, I'm really excited about it. He says, imagine someone murdered your baby. And Logan Paul's like, oh my God, why'd you do that? He's all like, I can't believe it. He goes, okay, I get your reaction, but imagine somebody did. And imagine God supports and affirms the murderer and just says, you know what, that's okay. I love you. Would you want that? And Logan's like, no, I want him brought to justice. Because, and this is what Cliff says, is really a good point. I don't know whether he borrowed this or just made this up himself, but it's a good point. It says, because your baby has value. Your baby means something. And so justice and judgment is about value. It's not about condemnation. So everything we do has value. Everything we do has significance. And yet it also has consequence. That's what the judgment brings. The judgment brings about, consequence, but it's because everything we do has value, because we have value. And so you can't have agents that run around on this earth that are completely valueless. And so, okay, so if someone were to destroy one of your children, you'd want them brought to justice because they mean something. And so the same thing goes to you. When you do something wrong to somebody else, you have to pay the consequence for that. And that's why we can't get past the consequence of sin.
Wow.
So does that make sense? I mean, all of these things make sense when you explore them.
Because and I love your talking about value.
Mm-hmm.
I've never thought of it like that.
Yeah.
Really good.
Well, the judgment is, we have it flipped, because the first century church, and really, ancient Israel, would have seen judgment and the judgment day, the great and terrible day of the Lord. All of these theological categories would have been like, yes, finally, justice. We see it the opposite. We see, oh, whoa, I don't want the cops. I don't want someone coming in here, and I don't want the judge banging down a gavel. You can't judge me, all that stuff. It is completely, it's so interesting how over the last 2,000 years, how the idea of justice has been turned on its head. Whereas the scriptures initially were like, oh, how beautiful. Like we will have value one day. Our lives will mean something one day.
Wow.
But now it's like we have everything. We are gods, essentially. And someone's going to tell us what to do? No, you can't tell me what to do.
Wow.
Isn't that fascinating?
That is really fascinating.
Yeah. So a lot of that, a lot of talking with atheists really has to do with having that long conversation. So I did this a couple of years ago. We had a young adult a conference, a one-day conference in February, and we were talking about truth. And I asked a friend of mine from high school, Reed. He was in my band in high school. He was the guitarist. I was the lead singer. It was great. Yeah. We called ourselves the Blind Venetians. You should have been there. So great. So great. We played all these like cover tunes and everything.
More time was probably spent on the name than practicing the music.
No, we were awesome. So I don't like that tone. So anyhow, I asked him, he's an atheist, right? And he tends toward like Buddhism. I was like, hey, can you come out to this thing? I'd love to interview you for like about 45 minutes and just talk about like what made you choose atheism, you know? He's like, sure. Yeah, I'll support you. No problem. So we've had a long, friendship, for a long time. And we get up there and we're talking and we're sharing all these stories and we're just laughing. And, like I'm asking him like, so what made you decide that God doesn't exist anymore? He's like, well, when I was in high school, I was dating a girl and I got really close to her. And I remember the youth pastor came up to me and he said, hey, you guys got to stop being so close to your girlfriend. You're going to wind up in hell. And I was like, he said that?
Wow.
And he's like, well, not in so many words. And so maybe he filled in the gaps on some of this, but he was definitely hurt by somebody, which led to this conclusion. So I say to people all the time, when you're having conversations with people who are atheists, it's not the issue, it's behind the issue. And so as we talked about this, I'm like, so, what would convince you to come back to the faith? And essentially he was just saying like authenticity, like real people. Like that would be something, When I got off the stage, I probably had about a dozen young adults come up to me and they were like, I can't believe that you guys disagreed so greatly and yet you loved each other. Because that was one of the last things we said. It was like, love you, man. Thanks for being here. And I'm like, I can't believe you loved each other. People today haven't seen people with totally different ideas sit down, disagree, and love each other. And so I think if anything, regardless of the points, regardless of the talking points, the arguments, the Logan Paul, any of that, regardless of that, if you can just sit down with somebody that's someone who's far from God or an atheist, you just love them and be like, so what's your story? Tell me about it. And maybe share some truth with them, but like really to love them. I think that's the hugest thing.
I think everyone wants to be authentically seen and known.
Mm-hmm.
And that is whether it's a Christian or an atheist. And no one wants to be sold.
Yeah.
That was, this is the story I would end with is, from my perspective, I remember, and I've told this on the podcast before, but I remember when Steph and I, we were first married, didn't have many friends, didn't have any couple friends, and we ran into a couple at a bookstore, and the couple just struck up a conversation with us, and we were like, "Oh, this is great! This is great!" They actually want to be friends, and we were so excited. Steph and I were so excited, and we went to dinner then. And we had exchanged numbers with the other couple that we ran into the bookstore, and we were like, "Can you imagine if we just met our friends for life?" At the bookstore
in one meeting.
And the next day, I reached out to the guy, and we were like, "Hey, we're really excited to get together. Do you guys want to get together, next weekend or something?" And he was like, "Yeah. I have a really cool opportunity." And it was Amway. He was selling me.
No way.
He was selling stuff.
Was it Jason Mitchell?
It was. It was. It was so devastating. No, it was. He was literally selling. He's selling like a get rich quick thing.
Wow.
And I was like, "Oh,
that's awesome."
I was like, I don't think we want to do that, but we still want to get together." He's like, "Yeah, we're really."
Oh man.
So, but I always tell that story. Don't be that as a Christian.
Yeah.
Don't only give a crap about people.
Yeah.
Because you have a quota.
You didn't go. Oh, I guess he didn't go. You wanted to keep going. I would have wanted to see the whole Amway thing. That would have been fascinating.
Dude, I was way too
poor. You guys make soap?
Dude, I was so poor I couldn't put money into it just
That's
to see.
That's the best part. You can't buy anything. You just watch him do his thing.
Just be like, tell me more.
That's a great point, though. Yeah. Don't be the used car salesman. Don't be the Amway salesman. Don't be like, well, I really want to build a relationship with him because he could hear about the Lord. It's like, just build a relationship with him because you love him.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, and hopefully hopefully just the way you live your life and the way you handle the conversation will prove what is true.
Yeah.
It without question, it will prove what is true, maybe even beyond your words. So what do you say, John, to end? What do you say to the person that's just skittish and nervous about confrontation and doesn't know how to handle these conversations? What would you say the simple advice to someone that's heard this and that goes, that's all well and good, but how do I begin?
I'll give them my email address because I have stuff I want to sell. I got Amway. I got the trunk of my car. Some used audio.
Yeah, it's a podcast. It's good.
Wait. So what would I say to?
What would you say to someone that's just maybe they have a dear friend, a coworker, they have someone that has very noticeably expressed their skepticism to their faith in God, and so they could go one of two ways. They could bridge the conversation, or they stay safe and don't say a word. Yeah.
So a couple of things here, because you think that, okay, well, the thing is build bridges to everybody and everybody over and talk about them and listen to them and everything's wonderful.
Sounds so nice.
Yeah. But it's complicated because honestly, some of this has to do with where you're at. So if I'm a believer and I'm wavering, and who you are. If part of you is like, I have a lot of doubts and I'm not doing well with them right now. Like I wouldn't make it a huge priority to talk to a bunch of atheists because that could make you go like, I don't feel so good about this, Yeah. So I would advise you not to. I would probably say you need to spend some time with people who are really strong in their faith, and then you can maybe gain something from that.
That's really smart. That's good advice.
But if you are somebody who's a super Christian, no, I'm just kidding. If you're somebody who
like you,
yeah, exactly, just like me. No, I would say the thing would be if you feel like, well, no, I feel pretty good about where I'm at in terms of my relationship with God and what I'm doing, and I feel like I can do this authentically without being a hypocrite. I'd love to just hear what other people think, and there are people I work with, or maybe it's friends or neighbors or whatever. Have them over and be like, so tell me about your atheism. Don't do that.
Not a good way.
That'll be a lot of fun though. I could pull that off. I think,
you could try.
I could probably, I'd be like, so I'm an anthropologist. Tell me about your atheism. Is your atheism flaring up right now? Just gonna let that go. So, the whole idea though is I think listening is a huge part, and as you listen, you've got to separate out the argumentative or skeptical issues from the heart issues. And I think for the most part, the argumentative skeptical issues or the arguments themselves are not directly connected to the actual heart issue. And sometimes they are connected, but you might be playing this shadow war over here when it has nothing to do with the actual issue of like somebody really messed them up when they were younger, or they really are hurting because of XYZ. And so you're not going to play the savior. You're not going to go in there and solve all their wounds or anything, but just going to listen. And then I think 90% of the time you will find that like this issue over here of what they don't believe actually had more to do with the thing that was underneath here. And if they trust you enough to let you in on that, be very, very respectful. I'd be like, thanks for sharing that with me. Yeah, that stinks what happened to you. And don't try to solve it. Just listen to it for now. Yeah.
And I think there is some pressure we put on ourselves that I don't think God is trying to put on us. Mm-hmm. This idea that we are the rescue. Mm-hmm. I think God is the hero of the story. Yeah. And Jesus is the hero of the story, and we're just one tool to be used to reach people.
Well, we're the rescue, we're the superhero, we are the lawyer. Again, I keep saying this, we're not lawyers, we're witnesses. And so a lot of times people think, well, I'm a Christian now, so I know everything. And it's a weird thing. People will become Christians like, oh, I know the truth. No. You know who the truth is. Jesus is the truth. You don't know everything. You don't, just because you know what you prayed in order to follow Jesus doesn't mean you know everything. And you're going to get squashed like a grape argumentatively if you try to go up against somebody. However, you can talk about your experience and you can say like, this is how I came to Jesus. This is what's important to me. Pascal, I think it was Pascal, real famous philosopher, scientist. he had all these books, like these incredible thought-provoking books, these pensées, and yet, and it's a mystery, sewed into the inside of one of his jackets. And I'm not gonna quote it right. He scribbles down like 4 lines, and he gives a date. It's like November 10th. I don't know what the date was. The God of Abraham, the God of Jacob. I'm totally not getting this right, but fire. It was like all these words that were about this indescribable experience he had with Jesus that just changed him. So much so that he sewed it into his jacket. And he never told anybody about it, never wrote about it, never anything. And so, like, people have such interior lives. If they trust you with it, just tread softly. And then if you're able to, at some point, appreciate the depth of where they are, then you can throw in a couple things after you have the relationship. Like, hey, did you see this thing? Check this out. Actually, this shows that the Old Testament, this part of it was really accurate in what it was saying. Like, it can be slowly just.
That's awesome.
Yeah, good stuff.
And John, you actually wrote about how to handle different disagreements and conflicts in your book.
Yeah.
No Argument for God.
Yeah. 12 years ago. It was a long time ago.
So if people want to hear more,
Amazon.
Yeah, there you go.
Go to Amazon.
Can we give away 2 copies? So
why not?
Leave a comment in the comment section, and we're gonna give away 2 copies.
No Argument for God.
No Argument.
And basically, it's like this. So listen. If we're going to talk about how God doesn't make sense, and I love this. It's like so many times people come to me and be like, it's irrational. It's stupid. It's this idea of God creating out of nothing, the whole idea of grace, of Jesus dying and rising again. It's irrational. I come at it from the book and be like, yeah, it's got to be. Like, you can't be rational and be God. Like, rational is like the framework where everything's created in. God's above that. He's meta-rational. So why are we trying to squeeze this all into something that makes sense? It's like taking a globe and making a map out of it. Like, maps are great and all, but like Greenland is huge. Like, Australia's giant. When I was a kid, I wanted to go to Greenland because I was like, it's so huge. And then I saw on the globe, I'm like, oh, it's just this little thing. Because maps distort. And so when we try to take something like God, who has depth and like all this stuff that's ineffable, and we flatten it out and say, oh, this is how we understand it. It's X and Y coordinates. It's going to distort it every time. And so that's where the book's coming from. It's like, no, revel in the globeness. Stop being maps.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Well, it's not amazing. So it's okay. It's an okay book.
It sounds real quite good. So we'll give away a couple copies.
Sure.
But John, thank you so much. And, we'd love to have you back.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
There's tons of questions.
Yeah, we only got like 2 of them.
There's like 10, 15 questions that we had.
Oh, there's so much better ones too.
So we're gonna ask lots of different questions, and we're gonna get to them in the future. But thank you so much for listening to the Live Change podcast. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure you like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to read those comments. And as always, now that your life changed by Christ, make sure you live that change out.